All right, okay, I think we're going now. So, this all seems a bit strange to me anyway, but hey ho. So I'm going to make you a video. This is for the group that I share with Miss Brooke. And the topic of the video, or the lesson that I want to try and do with you, is on topic 1.2.10, which is alternative views of consumer behaviour. That's how it's described in the syllabus. The PowerPoint that I've produced that also includes some fantastic hyperlinks to some great YouTube videos which you really must watch. Yeah, so it's the PowerPoint's on behavioural economics, but it's basically the same thing as alternative views of consumer behaviour. So let's get into this. Let me just give you a brief overview of it, or maybe not so brief. Let's see how it goes. Right, so the first thing is that's on the specification is the reasons why consumers may not behave rationally. So I think to get into this, we need to first understand what behaving rationally actually is. So from a classical economist's perspective, I would say that somebody behaves rationally when they're making utility maximizing decisions with either their time or with their limited money income, or for that matter with any scarce resource. So let's take some examples of that. When spending money, you would be behaving rationally if you bought, let's say, a Mars bar because you believed that the marginal private benefit of consuming the Mars bar to you is greater than the marginal private cost. Somebody might behave irrationally if they buy some other product. Maybe they make a rushed decision. They don't weigh up their marginal private benefits and their marginal private costs, and maybe they end up making a decision with their limited money income and how they spend it, so that they regret. So they end up buying something and they subsequently realize that the marginal private cost of buying that product was actually greater than the marginal private benefit. If that's the case, then you would say that person has behaved irrationally. In terms of time, you could say, well, you might have 3 or 4 different ways that you could spend an evening. You could spend it computer gaming, you could spend it watching TV, or you could spend it maybe doing some academic work. So if you were behaving rationally, you would choose the option that would maximize your private benefits over your private costs. Of course, sometimes people don't always make those calculations effectively in their own mind, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later on in the video. But that's basically what happens, is that people make decisions that they might subsequently regret, because the private benefits and private costs occur at different points in time. So for example, if you have a dossy student, who has no self-discipline, they might just choose to spend all of their time computer gaming, because in the short run that's the option that maximizes their private benefits over their private costs. However, maybe in 5 or 10 years time they subsequently realize that that was a terrible error, that they massively overestimated the private benefits of gaming, and massively underestimated the private benefits of getting some work done. Maybe they're in some dead-end job. It's all too late, and all they can do is regret the actions that they took in the past, which, with the benefit of hindsight, they might label as being irrational. They might label their own past behavior as being irrational. So that's that. Okay, so the next blob on the syllabus is consideration of the influence of other people's behaviour. So the idea here is it's that the classical economists, the mainstream, they would say that we're all individuals. We're all unique. The only example of us that will ever exist. Our tastes and preferences are completely different, or can be very, very different. Let's put it that way. So my pursuit of my subjective value might be very different from yours, and classical economists basically assume that we make our decisions as individuals by weighing up our own distinctive private costs against our own distinctive private benefits. People that believe in behavioural economics, the so-called alternative views of consumer behaviour as described in the spec, they're interested in psychology. They're really psychologists. What they say is that humans are social animals. Just think about that for a second. So as a consequence of that, when we make decisions, we don't make our decisions as individuals. A lot of people just make their own decisions by copying the behaviour of other people around them. In essence, then, they follow group norms. Probably the best example of this could be fashion. You know, people wear all sorts of ridiculous clothes. That's my subjective assessment. Joke. Because other people do it, and that's it. So they're not actually weighing up their private benefits and private costs at all as individuals. All they're doing is just taking shortcuts. They're just looking at what you might call the wisdom of the crowd, and rather than going to the trouble of weighing up private costs and private benefits, they don't bother with any of that. They just think, well, there's plenty of smart people out there doing X, Y, or Z. I can't be bothered to weigh up the private benefits and private costs occurring at different points in time. I'll just take a shortcut and just follow the herd. So this is, behavioural economists call this phenomenon herding. And in the exam, you need to litter your answer with that word, herding. Yeah, it will attract ticks. And basically, herding, one more time, it basically means that people don't make decisions as individuals. Instead, they respond as groups. Group norms are very important, and people will tend to conform to them. Okay, so why is this a bad thing? Well, again, behavioural economists would say, well, sometimes the herd might be heading in the wrong direction. So people could end up making decisions that fail to maximise their utility because they didn't think for themselves. Yeah, I can understand that. I'm not a great one for following group norms myself, so I can kind of buy into that. Thinking of a practical example of where herding has caused economic pain would be speculative bubbles. So a speculative bubble arises in a micro market where the market price accelerates, it increases as a consequence of increases in demand. Try and see a supply and demand diagram, maybe for the housing market in your head. So you've got supply, upward sloping, demand, downward sloping. If people expect the price of housing to increase, and this becomes, I don't know, part of the culture, people think that you can't go wrong with property, house prices always go up, but other kind of mantras that people just buy into, unthinking, uncritically, because other people it's just a prevailing wisdom, that can then cause problems, because the increase in demand created by this herding causes a self-fulfilling prophecy. The increase in demand forces the price of housing up. Other people who haven't entered into the speculative bubble will maybe listen more carefully to the group norms, and they'll think, well, maybe these people are right. Maybe the get rich quick scheme is to go to the bank, borrow as much money as possible, and take it down to the housing casino and whack it all on buy-to-let property. And if more and more people do that, the demand for housing will increase a second time, which causes house prices to increase for a second time. Other people who didn't participate in the bubble previously will notice that house prices have risen for a second time, and they might decide to join the market too. So you just get this escalation in prices. Why is that a problem? Well, if you believe in classical economics, that Adam Smith, Hayek, etc., prices act as signals. So in this case, herding is sort of distorting price signals in the sense that it's indicating that we need more and more property, more. And there's a lot of buy-to-let properties that are just not livable. They're very small flats, tiny rooms, that they're not really. Many of the houses and flats that were built were almost built as casino chips in a speculative game, rather than as homes for people to live in. Of course, the party ends. The speculative bubble pops eventually when the rental yields, the rents on the properties, are relatively low compared to the sky high price of housing. And because rents are relatively low in relation to the current price of housing, that means that the yield, the rate of return on owning buy-to-let property, starts to drop. And it's at that point that the clever money leaves the market. You then get an increase in supply. That increase in supply starts to push house prices down, and then suddenly the herd turns. Rather than the consensus being that house prices can only go up, the opposite starts to happen, and you have a full-blown housing crash. This is what happened in the early 1990s in the UK. So it's herding the herd can sometimes head in the wrong direction. So yeah, regardless of A-level economics, think for yourself. That was one of my golden rules personally. Okay, so let's move on to the second bullet point. The second bullet point is the importance of habitual behaviour. So what is habitual behaviour? Well, habitual behaviour means that you routinely buy the same products, and maybe even the same brands, over and over and over again. And a behavioural economist might see this as being irrational, because there could actually be better deals available elsewhere. And rather than staying with your current supplier, you should switch. But people are lazy. They suffer from this habitual behaviour. Another phrase that's often used to describe this phenomenon is, what's the phrase now? Yeah, consumer inertia. And the classic example is banks. Most people sign up for a bank account, or many people do, in their childhood, teens, or maybe just prior to going to university. And they stick with that bank all the way through their adult life. And banks know that consumers, many of them can't be bothered to change accounts, so the bank can screw the consumer over with ridiculously low interest rates on savings, rip off banking charges, like for example these days banks charge you money for withdrawing your cash from a bank machine, or many do. And if you're a borrower, well, you might be hit with very, very high interest rates. People would say that this consumer inertia, this habitual behaviour, is irrational because there might be better deals elsewhere. So why do people, this begs the question, doesn't it? If better deals are available, why are consumers inert? Why do we have this habitual behaviour phenomenon? I think there's maybe three reasons. The first one is the consumer might be suffering from an information gap. So they might stick with their current provider because they just don't know that a better deal elsewhere is available. Second thing is hassle, time. Maybe some people are reluctant to swap from one supplier to another because they have a high time preference. They place a high monetary value on their own time. And from their subjective perspective, they believe that the opportunity cost of faffing around on the internet, losing leisure time, trying to find a better deal, it's just not worth it compared to the benefits of maybe finding a supplier who can either offer a lower price or a better quality product. There's evaluation. You could argue, well, maybe for some people that might be true, particularly if you've got money to burn. Why would you be interested in just saving a little bit of money on a cheaper broadband or something? If you're earning thousands of pounds a day at Goldman Sachs, why would you bother? It's just an irrelevance. It's like that 2p that's lying on your bedroom carpet. Who cares? I'm not bothered. Maybe you place a high value on personal contacts with your current provider. So you might exercise habitual behaviour towards your, I don't know, hairdresser or something, or pub, because you just like hanging out with the person that does the service for you. Okay, the third reason for habitual behaviour and not switching, and I think this is quite a good one, is the idea of loss aversion. So what that means is that you're worried that if you were to make a switch from your current provider, you might be jumping out of the proverbial frying pan into the proverbial fire. So you're worried that if you switch, you could, rather than being better off, you could actually become worse off. Yeah, and I think that's a relevant point. Again, thinking about broadband, I know Virgin offer in their advertisements promises of all sorts of super fast broadband speeds, but many people and cheap prices maybe, but many people, you could call them cynical if you want, they don't trust certain companies that will remain nameless. So they stick with their current provider because they're worried that if they switch, they could be spanked with some hidden charges. A good example of that would be Ryanair. You log on their website, super low prices, you book it up, and then you get spanked by them with extra fees for your bags, extra fees to sit next to your wife or your son. No comment. And other things like that. Sorry about that. There was some just annoying pop-up and just distracting me. Yeah, so that's loss aversion. Yes, you can understand that with especially in markets where there could be asymmetric information between buyer and seller. So it looks, you see an advert you think, well, maybe I should switch, but then you think, well, maybe not. Maybe not. If I switch, I could end up with higher prices through hidden charges, a pricing tariff that's not particularly transparent, and God knows what the quality of service is going to be like. And yeah, and then I've got the time penalty of trying to sort it all out. And obviously that's a big issue with banking. Excuse me. So, so far then, we've done consideration of the influence of other people's behaviour, the importance of habitual behaviour. The last blob is consumer weakness at computation. So, what on earth does this mean? Well, simply put, computation of what? Computation of, I think it's computation of marginal private benefits against marginal private costs. People might not be able to make their own utility maximising decisions because they might not be able to accurately figure out what their marginal private benefits are versus their marginal private costs. They just might not be able to do it. Again, I don't really like this because I think some of these behavioural economists, they have a sense of superiority. They sort of think that they're clever and many people are stupid, and they're a bit thick and they make stupid decisions and harm themselves because they're short-termist and they can't figure out the decision that will maximise their private benefits over their private costs. So, to give you some examples of where this could come up in an exam. So smoking, I think that came up in the exam about 3 years ago. So there's a concept of what's called optimism bias. So many smokers, not me, I don't smoke, never have, they know what their marginal private benefits are, which is the rush from the nicotine addiction. The private costs would be the cost of buying the fags, plus the damage to one's own health through smoking the cigarettes. So logically, you would smoke if you value the private benefits of smoking over the private costs. So behavioural economists would say that many people make stupid decisions because they don't fully understand what the long run private costs of smoking are. They're overvaluing the private benefits which flow in the immediate, and they're undervaluing the private costs which arrive at their maybe like 30-40 years into the future. So again, it's maybe about people waking up with some sort of hideous cancer 40 years after smoking, and then realizing that their behavior over the previous 4 decades was irrational, and if they could wind the hands of the clock back, they would do something different. Gambling would be another one. Many people, like, you could look at the national lottery, you know, I don't know what the odds are, but you know, they're ridiculously low. You're not going to win. It probably won't be you. But again, maybe a lot of people, they suffer from optimism bias. They get taken in by the claim that it could be you. So they end up wasting their own money buying lottery tickets and scratch cards. So a behavioural economist would say that that's bad, and we need to stop that, because people, stupid people, working class people, they're too stupid to maximise their own utility. So we need to ban stuff like gambling, because it's causing misery in other people's lives. Not my life, but other people's. Same would apply with alcohol. Maybe something a bit more interesting. You could maybe think about students and studying. How many students know what the wage premium is for graduates over non-graduates? how many people make their decision about what university course they want to study in a logical, rational way by weighing up the private benefits of studying, which would be the pleasure of studying the course for 3 years, sure, but it would also include the probability of getting a better paid job multiplied over a 40-year working life. And then you would compare that against the private cost, which would be the cost of the course, so plus living costs, so maybe 50 grand, plus the opportunity cost of not earning an income whilst you were at university. So I guess with students, maybe some students are not behaving rationally. I'm not sure about all of this myself though, because as I say, we've all got our own preferences. So the private benefits and private costs of one person can be very different from another. But then behavioural economists, they tend to specialise in smearing other people's behaviour as being irrational. So yeah, I'm not massively keen on that, to be honest. Okay, so yeah, then you've also got the issue of weakness at computation, maybe because people are addicted to something. You know, they're not making good decisions because they're high on drugs or alcohol or something. Okay, final thing. What are the implications of behavioural economics, or these alternative views of consumer behaviour? Perhaps the biggest is the idea of nudge theory. So according to nudge theory, central planners, the state, should try to influence people's behaviour in order to get them to make better decisions. At its most benign, this might be by providing people with more information. So for example, forcing banks to disclose charges and maybe setting up state price comparison sites on the internet, maybe. So if you're interested, you can check out whether you're being ripped off or not, or whether there are cheaper deals available elsewhere. Other less benign forms of nudge theory might be maybe the government provides society with false information to try and influence decision making in a particular direction that the central planners desire. I wouldn't put that. That might sound conspiratorial, but I'm sure that happens. Obviously, indirect taxes, subsidies, regulation, these can all be used to steer or nudge consumers into choices and behavioural patterns that behavioural economists who are working for the government desire. The bottom line for me is this is all great, provided that the nudgers, those that are doing the nudges, are wise. They might not be. That's the problem. So some good examples: for 30 years, the population in Britain has steadily been gaining weight. Over that same period of time, we were encouraged to cut down on high-fat food. Most health professionals now realise that it's sugar that's the problem. So, you know, the government was nudging us away from healthy food towards sugary food. So, not great. So, if you're going to use nudge theory, you need to be absolutely right about your facts. And the problem is, I think, with many central planners, is that they suffer from what Hayek described as fatal conceit. They're arrogant. They might not be all-knowing. They might not know more about what maximizes your utility than you do yourself. Yeah, and then one last example would be petrol and diesel engine cars. So diesel produces less CO2 than petrol engine cars. So Gordon Brown, to meet our Kyoto climate protocol commitments, whatever, decided to cut the rate of indirect tax on diesel and increase it on petrol. I think for a while there were even scrappage schemes that encourage people to junk perfectly good petrol engine cars to be replaced with brand new diesels. This was fantastic news for car manufacturers, absolutely fantastic. It then later transpires that although diesel does produce less CO2, it also produces fine particulates which cause cancer. So the net effect of the nudge away from petrol towards diesel has been thousands of deaths in places like London from respiratory problems and cancers. So nudge theory can morph into an example of government failure, a situation where the state has intervened, and rather than making things better, it's actually made things worse. Right, I'm now going to save this. I've been going on for half an hour. That's enough. Let's hope it saves. Okay, bye.